Hi there, welcome to Geography, and this video is about the geography of Islam. Islam is the religion of 20% of the world today. Even parts of the West, like France, for example, is 7% Islamic today due to migration, especially from former colonies. Canada is 3% Islamic, due largely to its very open immigration policy in the last several decades. And then also due to migration, the US is about 1% Islamic. So even though Islam started in Arabia, in the Middle East, it's not where the largest Islamic populations in the world are today. The biggest Islamic populations are found in South and Southeast Asia. So if you look on the map, the number one largest Islamic population in the world is in a very large country, which is Indonesia. So you have the number 2, 3, and 4 Islamic populations are Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Why those? Well, Pakistan and Bangladesh are extremely dense countries. People often say that they're some of the most overpopulated countries in the world. And then, but you might say, well, isn't India a Hindu country? And it's true. India has 80% Hindus, but it's such a big country overall. Its population is so immense that the minority group that's Islamic still is the number 3 Islamic population in the world. So it just goes to show you how big India is. And besides the Asian countries on the map, you can also see that in Africa, there are large Islamic populations. When you think Islam, you may think a dry world and hot. And that will be correct, that in Arabia, the climate is very hot and it is dry for sure. However, that is not all of the Islamic world. There's Islam in hot, humid, tropical countries, like we said, in Malaysia on the left, which is a jungle and rainforest climate originally. And on the right, you can see up in Central Asia, it's quite cold, especially in the wintertime in Kazakhstan. So you can have cold and wet climates, not just hot and dry in the Islamic world. And it's also important to realize that Islam, like Christianity and other religions, takes on a different regional flavor depending on the underlying pre-existing cultures that were there before that blend with the Islam. And so to understand why Islam is where it is today, which is the geography is about what is where and why. To understand that, you have to understand a little bit of the history to see how it got to those places, the historical geography of Islam. And so on this map, you can see that Islam started where the blue box is in the bottom, Mecca, which is where Muhammad lived. And after his death in 632, it spread quickly. The brown arrows show how his followers spread it. This would be in cultural geography through diffusion, especially through contagious diffusion from person-to-person contact, and also through relocation diffusion by picking up and moving to another place and then relocating. For example, on the Arab fleets, which sailed across the Mediterranean Sea. So these followers of Muhammad, they spread Islam very, very quickly, far across North Africa. You can see the brown arrows. Okay, so Islam started in Arabia, but then it spread as far west as Spain and as far east as India. An important thing to realize is that when you look at the map, you can see Islam ruled most of Spain for hundreds of years, what we would call the Middle Ages. And it reached most of Spain until that top part there. So there's a part of Spain in northern Spain that held out against Islam right before you get to the Pyrenees Mountains in France. And those people up there are very proud. They sort of solidified and tempered, you might say, like steel, like a sword that's been tempered, their religion against the challenge of Islam. And you also notice that there is an arrow going into France when Islam was first spreading. And they did make incursions into France, but Charles Martel, who was Charlemagne's father, was the military leader who held back the Muslims and pushed them back at Tours and defeated, as my old history teacher used to say, the Moors at Tours. Moors is another word for Islamic peoples in that region. So that was as far as the Islamic incursions ever got to Tours in France. They were pushed back, but they really never settled and conquered anywhere past Spain. Here you see some Bedouin nomads today, and this is Muhammad's culture, the culture that he came out of. And again, they were just one of several groups that were migrating and moving around the Arabian Peninsula, and different sets of ideas kind of combined together and played off each other to create this new religion that Muhammad sort of synthesized. He was sort of a synthesizer who brought different belief systems together to create a new religion, Islam. So let's just make a global connection. So when Islam spread across the map, like we saw, it connected with a pre-existing set of trade routes that was already there that was not necessarily Islamic before, which is the Silk Road. The Silk Road is the connections between East and West, meaning between China and Europe. And all in between, you had these Central Asian cultures, cultures of places like Persia and what's now Baghdad, or Tehran in Iran, what's now Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Western China, like it says Kashgar on the map there. That's actually in Western China today. Guys on camels with carpets and spices, things like that, right? Moving around, taking Chinese inventions like gunpowder and silk and moving that westward towards Europe. So the Silk Road already pre-existed Islam. And so when Islam was created, it actually tapped into those Silk Road routes in order to move across the Middle East. And pretty soon, the middlemen of the Silk Road became Muslim middlemen. So that's a good way to think of most of the years of the Silk Road that would follow would be dominated in the middle by these Muslim middlemen all through the middle of Asia there. And it lent itself to being middlemen because those are traditionally, even today, Central Asia is an interesting region because it has traditional nomadic cultures. And nomadic cultures, no matter where you go, whether it's East Africa and Kenya and Tanzania, like the Maasai, or whether you go to northern Sweden and Finland, where you have the Sami people who herd reindeer, wherever you go, nomadic cultures typically live, they live with animals and they move with their animals, okay, whether it's camels or reindeers or goats or whatever. And so in Central Asia, they often, like in Mongolia, for example, will move long distances, like 9 times per year. And they have these portable yurts, there's houses that they bring with them. And that lifestyle of being in motion a lot lends itself to being a middleman across a vast region like Central Asia. Okay, so the way that these cultures lived, the nomadic lifestyle of moving periodically over long, long distances, riding horses and animals and stuff like that, that lent itself and made them very good at being middlemen connecting East and West on the Silk Road. The Islamic Golden Age coincides with all that. So as Islam spread, it became a very rich culture in the places that it reached. You had Islamic astronomers, Islamic explorers, mathematicians, invented algebra, brought foods like rice and orange and sugar back and forth across from Central Asia, from the Middle East, and all the way to Europe. So the Islamic Golden Age is very important to realize. And it's also important to realize that when Europe was sort of at its darkest during what we would call the Dark Ages, like the early Middle Ages, like 800, 900, 1000, 1100, those years before the Renaissance, this was actually the time when Islam was really thriving and flourishing. So when Europe was sort of at its darkest, Islam was at its peak at that time, the Golden Age of Islam. And so to give you 2 geographic related figures of that Golden Age, one, his name is Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was an explorer who went farther than Marco Polo. So he explored that Silk Road that we talked about. You see on the map is Marco Polo in red, Marco Polo's journeys. But then in green on the map is the journeys of Ibn Battuta even further. And then another famous Islamic geographer and cartographer from that time, from the Golden Age of Islam, is named Al-Idrisi. Idrisi is a very common name, last name in Morocco today. But Idrisi, his name is actually used now in a U.S. Army, U.S. military geographic information system software package. It's called Idrisi, after this Muslim cartographer here. This map was used by Columbus. And in this Islamic Golden Age, which I encourage you to explore because there's so many different facets to it, there are 2 key cities, which really 3, I'll mention one more, that really should mention. One is Baghdad, which today is the capital of Iraq. Then during the time from 1100 to 1200 was the world's largest city. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was a university learning center. And then that's in the east. And then farther in the west is Cordoba in Spain. And Cordoba today is still a cultural hearth of Andalusian culture. So Al-Andalus is the name of the kingdom, the Islamic kingdom in Spain at that time. Al-Andalus, the kingdom of Al-Andalus. It has the name today for the southern part of Spain. The southern region of Spain is called Andalusia in Spanish, or Andalusia in English. So we get flamenco dancing, we get bullfighting, we get a lot of things from that region today. And Cordoba, during the Islamic Golden Age, had streetlights, had running water. It was the most advanced and largest city in Europe. While in France, in the year 800, over 90% of people couldn't read. So it's a very different world at that time. This is before the Renaissance. The basic division within Islam populations is between Sunni and Shia. And these are the two main branches of Islam. After the death of Muhammad in 632, they split. And you can see on the map in the Middle East, there's a lighter green color there, which is the Shia center, which is mostly Iran, and its neighbor part, the eastern half of its neighbor, Iraq. And then the rest of the Islamic world is predominantly Sunni. So Sunni, by far, is the majority. About 85% of Islamic people are Sunni. And then this map shows that the greener it is, the more Shia it is, the more Shia minority, which is only 15% of Islam. So Iran, you could think of as like the Shia headquarters, so for the world. And Iran's government kind of looks at itself as that, and then provides funds for other Shia groups in that Middle Eastern region. So all the other groups there, like it's really the eastern part of Iraq where it meets Iran, is Shia. That actually splits Iraq. That's why Iraq is so difficult to govern, because Iraq has Sunnis on one side, Shias on the other. And then even on the Sunni side, it's split between most Sunnis and then the Kurdish Sunnis above it. They disagree. And the difference between Sunnis and Shias, without getting too deep into theology, it's basically over who should be the correct line of followers of Muhammad. So in the Sunni sect or branch of Islam, its Islamic officials are elected, so it's a little more democratic. And then in the Shia, it's appointed Islamic officials, so maybe a little more aristocratic. A theocracy is the name for a country where religious laws are the state laws, the political laws of the government. Okay, so where the religious law is the law on the street. And some examples of theocracies today would be Iran, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia. It's important to realize that a country can be a theocracy in part. You might have aspects of the law that are theocratic, that have religious law infused, or it could be a lot of the law. It depends on the country and the situation. And it can also be at different levels. You might have national level theocracy, but you also have sometimes individual localities, regions, states, parts of countries which have theocracies, which have religious law. When there's a theocracy in Islam, meaning when Islamic law is the law of the land, you call that Sharia law. Okay, so Sharia law on the map, you can see, is practiced in the countries that are colored on the map there. And it tells you on the left that in some places that means at the state level, meaning the national level. In some places that means at the regional level. And it could be down to even the family level, the local level. Of course, this is illegal in the United States, for example, a lot of Western countries that emulate the Bill of Rights, because in the US Bill of Rights and the Constitution, the First Amendment prohibits any kind of state religion. The state cannot have a religion that it forces on people. So you would never be able to have Sharia law anywhere. And that brings up a distinction between different types of Islamic societies. So on the one hand, you have Islamic societies where there's strict Sharia law, Islamic fundamentalist societies. This would be places like Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, which is now under the Taliban, even more strict now. And then you also, at the other end of the spectrum, and most countries are somewhere in the middle, you have more relaxed Islamic countries, meaning there's a clear separation of church and state. So, for example, Turkey is a good example, although Turkey is now changing. Today, it's kind of in turmoil. We'll talk about that in a moment. Bahrain, some of the more modern countries of the Middle East. So there's a real big difference if you go to different Islamic countries. Some Islamic countries, like if you go to parts of Istanbul, you think you're in Europe. And if you go to other places, you know, if you go to Saudi Arabia, you're going to see it's a very distinctly different type of society because they have religious laws everywhere you go. So I give you a couple examples. Turkey is, for a long time, has been sort of the poster child of a country that is westernized, like it's a democracy with a separation of church and state, and yet it's an Islamic country, right? Like the Turkish model, showing that an Islamic country can also be democratic and can be separating church and state. Now, keep in mind, in the West, we don't always have separation of church and state. It was really something that began after the French Revolution, and then even before that, the United States with the American Revolution, they had the Bill of Rights. But in the French Revolution, for example, before that, the French aristocracy and then the clerisy, the church, was actually a very, very politically powerful group in France. Okay, so many Western countries had the same thing. They had theocracies essentially for a long time, or at least some aspect of theocracy, with religion having an influence in government. But Turkey, I should say, Turkey is now very tumultuous. So they have a president, Erdogan, who is taking Turkey in a more fundamentalist direction. So some people might say, wait a second, I thought I read in the news that Turkey is moving towards more religious fundamentalism and cracking down on sort of modernization and westernization. That's true. But in general, compared to other Islamic countries, Turkey has been a model of separating church and state for a long time. A little background, what is Turkey? Turkey is basically the last bastion of what was the old Ottoman Empire. Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire back then, was lost in World War I. Its territory was taken away outside of Turkey. And the leader of Turkey was named Ataturk. His name was Ataturk. You see him on the right there. His real name is Mustafa Kemal. And people looked to Ataturk for like a new direction. And he said, you know what? We lost World War I because our culture is behind. We need to like catch up and modernize. And we need to kind of get with the program. And so he looked at the West, he looked at Europe, and he said, we need to have some of the things that they have. We're going to distinguish ourselves from our Arab neighbors. So Turkish language, like we said, it's not from the Middle East. It's not a Semitic language like Arabic or Hebrew. And it was written, though, in Arabic script, even though it was coming from far away, from the Turkic regions of Central Asia, like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So he said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to write our language in an Arabic script, which is not even our, original script from our even original region in Central Asia. We're going to switch over to a new alphabet. In other words, we're going to write the same language in a new alphabet. And they did it in a Western Roman alphabet that replaced the Arabic script. Secondly, they removed Islam as the official religion. Thirdly, they replaced Islamic laws. The Sharia law was just a Western secular code of law. And so many people today would say Turkey is a more secular country than some of its neighbors in the Middle East. They enforced monogamy instead of polygamy, and then women's rights were elevated. So these are specific reforms of Ataturk in the 1920s, and that sort of propelled Turkey into the modern world today. Let's go from one end of the spectrum to the other. So from Turkey, with more of a history of secularism, to the other end of the spectrum, let's go to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is an Islamic theocracy. It has a harsh type of fundamentalism called Wahhabism. And why do they do that? Because it's the place where Muhammad originated, where Islam originated. And so the government of Saudi Arabia, they look at the entire country, the land of Saudi Arabia, as a holy place, all of it. And so when you're in Saudi Arabia, you're in the land of Muhammad, you're in a holy place. So they look at it as a very, a place that needs to be protected through Sharia law. And so they have, for example, on the streets, they have a separate police just for religious violations, especially dress code violations by women, because a lot of the theocratic laws fall on women. So it's called the Mutaween. It's been in the news because sometimes these guys do bad things to women, violence and stuff, and so they abuse their power, and that's been in the news sometimes for those violations. So in Saudi Arabia, like I said, a lot of these Sharia laws, not all, but a lot fall on women. And for example, until very recently, women in Saudi Arabia were not able to drive. Now they can. Until very recently, women could not vote or run for office. Now they can, but um, that was how it was for a long time. Women couldn't drive, and some people actually argued that that was good for women because they get chauffeured all over the place. But today, still, women cannot. They have to cover up and cover their arms and head, etc., cover up their body. They, although I'm told that maybe differs a little bit in the way it's enforced between, say, Riyadh, the capital, and Jeddah on the other side of the country. Some of the more fundamentalist parts. They and women and men in Saudi Arabia have to use separate sections of restaurants unless they're with their family. For example, if you go to McDonald's here, you see there's a divider in the middle and women on one side and men have to order on the other. So you actually, in many restaurants, you come in a different door as well. There'll be a men's entrance and a women's entrance. So it's just totally separate. Like I said, if you're with your family, there'll be a family section where men and women can be together with their families. And last but not least, in Saudi Arabia, women can definitely go to school. Not only this, but they have the largest female university in the world, which is in the capital, Riyadh, over 50,000 students there. So just because it's Sharia law, you shouldn't think like there are parts of Afghanistan which have been in the news and Time magazine where the Taliban was keeping girls from going to school and things like that. Doesn't always, that's not what it means necessarily in Sharia law. For example, in this place, this is the opposite. They're funding women's education in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so those are two ends of the spectrum. Turkey on the one side, a more relaxed version of Islam. Indonesia, probably a little more relaxed as well, a good example. And then places like Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan on the other end of the spectrum, more fundamentalist, more Sharia law. In cultural geography, you talk about the idea of a cultural hearth. A hearth is where some cultural trait like a religion or a way of dress or a sport starts and then spreads from there. Some place where languages start and spreads out, something like that. And so you can have a primary hearth or you can have a secondary hearth. So in Islam, the primary hearth, meaning the place where the religion itself originated, is Saudi Arabia today, which is Mecca, like we said. But a secondary hearth is where some trait like the religion of Islam spread there, but then it spreads again from that new place. Okay, it's like a center of respreading, you might say. And so Pakistan is like that. In particular, the city of Lahore, Pakistan. It's a lot of traditional Islamic cultural features. So there are many mosques in Lahore, universities teaching Islamic subjects, Islamic architecture there, madrasas or Quranic schools where they study the Quran, the holy book of Islam. And you can see on the bottom, International Islamic University in Islamabad. There's also actually more sort of globalized universities in Pakistan, more westernized. There's one called LUMS, Lahore University of Management Science, and it's more patched into sort of global business and things like that. And Pakistan is a very interesting country because it actually has cultural splits. There's a Punjabi culture in the north of Pakistan, on the northern parts of the Indus River, where it fans out into many branches there and many tributaries. But also in the south, there's a Sindhi culture, which is very, very hot, where Karachi is in the south. And then in the west, there's also tribes out there, nomads, like Balukis and Balochistan. So Pakistan is a very divided country, and it has a lot of, partly because of that, it has a very long history of political turmoil. Its leaders have not lasted very long, and several of them have been removed, killed, etc., by the military, replaced. And so it's got a very tumultuous history. But it has an almost entirely Islamic population. And again, that's by design. After 1947, the partition of India, people who are Islamic in India, many of them moved out to Pakistan, which was designed to be an Islamic country. Just to clarify about madrasas, we said there's many madrasas in Pakistan, but madrasa, the word was in the news a lot, for linked to terrorism and things like that in the time of bin Laden and then the Taliban later, that they were pulling people from these Islamic madrasas who had been sort of, radicalized, etc. But the word madrasa in Arabic just means school. So it doesn't mean that every madrasa obviously is producing, radicalized people. It's just saying that there's a term used which certain madrasas teaching only Islamic subjects, and then certain ones of those were places where these terror groups could find people who had been radicalized or pulled them out. A good example of that particular sort of brand of madrasas is in the movie Syriana, which takes place in the Middle East. So from Asia, let's go to Africa. Africa, we said at the beginning, Islam spread quickly across North Africa. And sure enough, you look on the map, the more red it is, the more Islamic it is. And you can see North Africa is still very predominantly Islamic today. These are countries like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, etc. And what the big barrier is the Sahara Desert. So where Islam fades out is where the Sahara Desert is. And those countries in the middle there, like Chad and Sudan and Mali, those countries get cut through by the Sahara Desert. So you have North Africa, and then you have below the Sahara, Sub-Saharan Africa. So North Africa is predominantly Islamic. Sub-Saharan Africa is predominantly Christian or other religions. But there's a transition zone. Obviously, it's not a simple line where one culture stops and the other one starts. And so that transition zone has been very, very contentious. You see there's a line on the map, the same type of line, an ISO line like they use for weather fronts, for different types of air masses and a weather map. The black line with the little triangles on it. And the author of the map, who was Harm de Blige, who's a great late Dutch-American geographer, geographic educator, he called that the Islamic Front, like a weather front, between two sort of weather systems. And that front, he means the split between Islamic Africa and the rest. And the thing about it that makes it so contentious, especially, is that Islamic line, Islamic Front, goes through countries. It bisects, for example, Nigeria. You can see it goes right through the middle of Nigeria. It goes through, well, you can tell this map is older because it's Sudan, but now it's two Sudans. It's split in 2011. You can see here on this map. And why did Sudan split into Sudan and South Sudan? Because the north of Sudan is Islamic and the south is not. And they had a 36-year civil war that was brutal, with landmines. You saw pictures of kids getting their hands and legs blown off with landmines set up by government and things like that. So basically, this Islamic Front is split between the Islamic parts of Africa and the rest are very contentious, and they cause literally countries to split apart, like in the case of Sudan and South Sudan there. Same is true on the right of Ethiopia and its neighbors. So if you look at Ethiopia, Ethiopia is kind of a unique country because it's the only country in East Africa that was never colonized. And it is its own particular brand of Christianity, actually. It's called Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. It's not connected to Catholic, not Protestant, nothing like that, because Christianity actually reached Ethiopia early in the spread of Christianity before it reached Europe, well, parts of Western Europe, before it reached like Ireland or Spain or anything like that. So Ethiopia has had this ancient Orthodox Christianity. You can look it up. It's actually really cool illuminated Bibles, they call them, very colorful illuminated Bibles. But Ethiopia is also high up on a plateau. It's a very high country on the highlands, Ethiopian highlands. And so down below, as you reach the coast, you have Eritrea today, and you have Somalia and Djibouti. Those are all Islamic countries along the coast there. All Islamic because it goes right into Arabia on the other side, like Yemen there. And so this is a problem because there was a cultural split between people who wanted to be Islamic and people who wanted to be Christian, Ethiopia to be Christian, and they had wars decades ago. And what's Eritrea on the map today, the purple, it used to be Ethiopia's coastline on the Red Sea, and they lost it in these civil wars decades ago. So Eritrea is basically a country that broke off Islamic territory that broke off from Ethiopia. That Islamic Front really kind of cut through the older version of Ethiopia, which now has lost its coast, Eritrea. On the west, you see Nigeria. Nigeria is a giant population. It's the center of population density, humongous country. And they produce all kinds of goods for West Africa, a very huge economy. But Nigeria has a split, like we just said, that Islamic Front goes right through Nigeria. You can see it right there. And so it's showing you, right, how one part of the country, right, it says there's 51% Islam. So the top half of the country in Nigeria has actually declared, not only is Islamic, but they've declared Sharia law. See, it says in the legend right there. Okay, so if you look in the news, this is a major, major issue in Nigeria. It's almost like it's two countries. In Nigeria, the government of Nigeria is not controlled by Islamic groups, but the government, when Sudan was one country, it was controlled by Islamic groups. The majority government was Islamic, so it was flipped. And so Nigeria, Islam is sort of has to be contained by the government. And in the old Sudan, before South Sudan was broken off, Islam was the government. So, and also an interesting cultural connection with Islam. In the past, during the age of slavery to the Americas in triangular trade from Africa, from Europeans, shipping slaves from Africa to the New World, most of those Africans who were enslaved came from West Africa. And basically, that means that many of the people who were enslaved in the New World, like in the United States, for example, were actually originally Islamic. So it's something to think about. And if you look into American history, or even history of other places like Brazil and other places that had slavery, you'll see that there's an Islamic thread there that often gets unmentioned in history books. And it just goes to show you that these people, they had a culture, they had a history, they had a background there before they were sold into slavery. So from Asia and Africa, let's go to Europe. Islam is a very controversial topic in Europe today. In fact, you could say that some elections in Europe are hinged on the question of Islamic immigration and Islamic cultures in Europe today. It's a very big split between Europe's conservatives and liberals, left and right, over what to do about Islam in Europe and Islamic immigration. So first, let's see, where did Islamic populations come from that are now in Europe, and then we could talk about the issues that it faces. Islamic cultures in Europe came from several different places. One is, in the past, many European countries like France, even Spain, but mostly France and then Britain, had major colonies overseas, which were in Islamic countries. For example, France colonized right across the Mediterranean in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and those areas are all Islamic. And those people, after France pulled out of those colonies, many of the people from the colonies went into France. So if you go to a major city like Marseille, which is one of the biggest cities in France on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, there's whole areas of downtown Marseille which look like basically people on the street are all North African. They're from Islamic countries. You have falafel stands left and right, halal food, etc. So it's a very large group of people. Like we said, it's 7% of France is now Islamic, but it's not just 7%. It's 7% concentrated in particular areas like Marseille and suburbs of Paris, etc. So former colonies is one source of Islamic populations. In Britain, that's true too, because colonial India, for example, included Pakistan and Bangladesh, plus India's Islamic population. So there's a lot of Islamic people who migrated to Britain as well. So besides the former colonial Islamic populations who've moved to Europe, you also have today many, many, many millions of migrants moving from civil wars in the Middle East, for example, from Iraq and now from Syria. So I think it was 2015, if I'm not mistaken, Germany took 1 million Syrian refugees in a single year. 1 million Syrian refugees. That is a lot of people. So from one country in 1 year, plus in the subsequent years and before that as well. So you can see that, when you take that many people from a single country in a single year, some people in Germany were questioning, okay, this is a lot of people. Is this going to change our culture, etc.? Not to mention that many of those migrants, those refugees, got great benefits actually from Germany: a free apartment, free house. They often used like cities and towns in Germany where there's a low population, which is actually one of the reasons Germany took those migrants in some ways is because Germany has low fertility, they have low population growth. And Germany would give those migrants a house, for example, in a small German town where there's only like 300 people in the town or 1,000 people to kind of bring the town back to life again. So in these underpopulated small towns of Germany, many of these refugees got relocated. It's very kind of interesting. And you can imagine how the cultural conflicts about between those refugees and the sort of more provincial Germans and how that went, you know. So that's a major source of Islamic immigrants into Europe today. The major countries that, for example, Syrians targeted when they came, many Syrians, you know, they had a hard time getting out of Syria. They got on rafts, inner tubes. They floated over to, you know, from Turkey, and they floated over to islands of Greece. They got ferries across Greece, and they walked across Eastern Europe through Hungary out the other side. And this, you know, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers on foot, with their life and their cell phone and nothing else. And many of those people targeted Germany and Sweden as places to try to get to, because those two countries paid the best benefits to refugees. It has worked out for some of those migrants really well, but in some cases it hasn't, meaning there's been issues with, and this is one of the contentious issues, is that some of these Islamic migrants have not fit in well. I mean, it's difficult to learn German when you're already middle-aged, you know, or for anybody really. It's not a world language, so that's a problem. Having said that, a lot of people in Germany do speak English, but you can see there'd be a cultural conflict with learning Swedish, learning German. It's not so easy. So there's been cultural clashes, and even beyond all that, there are clashes because many Europeans are just anti, you know, immigrant in the sense of against Islamic immigration, because they just are afraid of diluting German or French or European culture in general, right? They just feel like Islamic immigrants come from a fundamentally different culture or civilization, and they would rather preserve European culture. That's debatable whether that's a good or bad position, but that's what it is. It's interesting because Islam is actually growing in Europe. It's growing fast in Europe as a religion. And ironically, Europe is the source of, you know, Christianity in the Americas, right? They brought Christianity with Columbus and the missionaries and stuff like that. And yet Christianity is now diminishing a bit in Europe. It's decreasing, the practice of Christianity, becoming more secular in Europe. So as Christianity is declining in Europe, Islam is rising. It's interesting. So former colonial populations that are moving to Europe, and then refugees from civil wars. Those are two major sources of Islamic migrants. A third category of Islamic migrants is just people who literally just seek asylum or just float in as economic migrants from Africa. If you look up the boat people, there's people who are in very desperate situations in Africa, and they get on these, you know, boats together. Lots of people cluster on them. They try to float across the Mediterranean. They don't always make it. Sometimes they sink, and it's tragic. But they try to make it to islands like the Canary Islands or Lampedusa in Italy, just to escape the overpopulation of these population explosions in Africa. And so that's another source sometimes of Islamic migrants. And so a major controversial issue in specifically is the building of mosques in Europe. And these mosques, like you see at the bottom there, the Great Mosque in Paris, these mosques can be put up really quickly because there are oil countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates in the Middle East, which can fund them with millions and millions of dollars. And so another bone of contention, because not every person in Europe wants to see mosques in their cities and countries. You know, Europe has a very long heritage of architecture, and it's beautiful streets from going back for hundreds of thousands of years that attract tourists from around the world. And so they have that very rich culture. And, you know, some Europeans feel that's a challenge to their culture, or just sort of doesn't mix or fit with their normal culture. So there are actually rules in some countries about that. For example, in Switzerland, they actually have made minarets illegal. You cannot build minarets in Switzerland on a mosque, which is a fundamental part of a mosque. And so that kind of goes to a bigger point about Muslims in Europe. So one of the reasons Muslims have not sort of assimilated into European society always, some have actually, so we don't want to make a blanket statement, but maybe a little more difficult than perhaps in the United States, is that countries have never really had the same type of sort of pathways to citizenship and the educational scaffolding, you might say, the ladder up to learn the languages and things like that they have to integrate new cultures into Europe. In America, we make Americans. People come to America and we have all these systems. Think of all the ESL classes we have in K through 12 and college and adult ESL programs. I've taught these programs, so hundreds of thousands of people do this and they become Americans. We make Americans, and we have Hollywood movies basically around the world, basically teaching people on the movies how to become American, how to act like you're an American. In Europe, they haven't always had those things, right? They don't have such extensive pathways, not only to citizenship, but just pathways to understanding the culture and the bridges between new cultures and European cultures. And so that's one of the issues that have faced Muslims in Europe as well. Let's go to Germany, and then we'll look at France. So Germany is a country which, as we said, has a low population growth because they have had low fertility and not having enough babies to replace the current population. And so what can you do when you're in that situation? If you want to keep the population up, well, you can bring in migrants. And so Islamic migrants have been a major source of migration to Germany. Now with Syria, but even in the past, if you go to after World War II, Germany lost World War II and then they were in rubble. And so they had to rebuild the country. And they lost a lot of their males too, because the males were fighting in wars. And so what can they do? Well, they actually took in a very large number of Turkish people from Turkey at that time after World War II to be part of what they call I'm going to pronounce it horribly, but the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle after World War II of rebuilding Germany. That's how like anything is possible. Let's remake this country out of the ashes. The rebuilding of Germany had to be done by people, though, and you needed more people. So we had all these Islamic Turkish people coming into Germany. They were called Gastarbeiter. Again, I'm pronouncing it terribly, but it's like guest workers. And they were supposed to stay just to work and then go back after a period of time, maybe 3 years, etc. Well, what actually happened was many of those guest workers not only stayed past 3 years, they stayed for life. And then they had kids. And then they had kids. And now we're in your third or even fourth, maybe generation today. So what you have is people like Ozil on the right there. You have an international soccer star in Germany. A lot of people know who he is. And he is Turkish German. So it's an example of a success story of Turkish migration to Germany. But on the flip side, there's other people who are in the Turkish minority in Germany who have just not assimilated well. And that led Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel 10 years ago, something like that, to say multiculturalism is dead in Germany. And she didn't mean multiculturalism as in like having different cultures is dead. That's not what she meant at all. It got misinterpreted. What she meant was that a lot of Turkish people, migrants, because there were not these pathways to assimilation, had not really assimilated. And they were living in these sort of ghetto pockets, right? Ghetto is an ethnic group that lives in a particular space because they are often unable economically or legally to leave that space. And so she said that's dead, meaning like it doesn't work. We figured out that we can't just have a minority group like Turks living in these isolated neighborhoods, not speaking German, speaking Turkish all day, not assimilating. It doesn't work. Okay, so on the left, you see an actual Turkish school in Germany where people go to school in Turkish, even in those neighborhoods. So now, just in the last decade or so, Germany's trying to ramp up its assimilation programs into German culture, and that helps the Turkish people who are already there who are Islamic, and also helps the new refugees from places like Syria. But as I said, elections have been won and lost. in Europe, partly on issues of what to do about migration, especially Islamic migration. So let's go from Germany to France. France is the largest Muslim population in Western Europe. It's an incredible, really 7%, 2 million Muslims in France, most of them from former colonies like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. But there's actually, believe it or not, 100,000, more than 100,000 of the Islamic population in France are just regular French people who converted to Islam. It's kind of interesting. There's a major, conflict in France over the years between France's French Revolution ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité, or the liberty, equality, and fraternity, where they had laws banning any kind of religious articles in schools because they wanted this sort of secularize France, get religion out of public life. And because remember, before the French Revolution, the church was very highly linked to the aristocracy and had political power. They don't want that. Well, that didn't sit very well with Islamic cultures because there's like, well, that's what we do. We have to wear these hijab or this headscarf, etc. everywhere we go. We can't. That's part of it. That's who we are. And so that there was a clash between Islamic French people and the ideals of not wearing religious clothing. So it was a very big deal for them. And really, you should realize though that it applies to everybody. Those rules applied to Christians, Jews. You couldn't wear a Jewish star on your necklace. You couldn't have a cross on your earrings. You couldn't have any religious articles. Couldn't even have a cross on the wall in French schools. So that's important to know that it's across the board. It's not just targeting one religion. As we said, many Islamic people have assimilated well into French society. Keeping in mind that unlike Germany, many people who came to France as Muslims already spoke the language. They already spoke French because French is spoken in Morocco. French is spoken in Algeria, Tunisia. So, German is not spoken in Syria, but the people who came from French colonies in other parts of the world, even Lebanon, for example, spoke French already. So it was much more easy for them to assimilate. And many of them are well assimilated into French society. And, some are not, but it depends where you go. And there has been violence in some situations in France. You may have seen in the news, there's been some terrorist activities in Paris, for example, nightclub shootings. And where does that come from? How do people get radicalized in France? And basically, it's the same thing as in Britain. It turns out they have found that the populations like Islamic, youth, for example, who become radicalized, it's not that they come from other countries sort of already pre-radicalized. It's that, like a lot of immigrants in general, some Islamic immigrants end up living in these distant suburbs, like in the outskirts of Paris, the banlieue, this, suburban pockets, which in Europe, everything's kind of reversed. In America, we have inner cities. We think of inner city problems like crime, illiteracy, homelessness, drug use, things like that, right? Well, they don't do that the same way in Europe because Europe's inner cities are like gorgeous, right? They're these, medieval or Enlightenment buildings, and it's beautiful tourist attractions. So the same kind of problems we have in inner cities in America, they don't allow that there. They preserve their inner cities, historic inner cities, and those kind of problems are in certain suburbs, not all suburbs, but certain suburbs. So in suburbs is where you're going to find what we would call inner city problems a lot of times. And some of those suburbs are almost entirely Islamic and very poor in some cases. And it's in those kind of areas where the people can basically be living in almost like an alternative universe to the rest of, say, Paris or London. And police have said sometimes there's no-go zones where they just don't even go in there because they're afraid to, basically. They're not welcomed. And so essentially it's those type of disconnected youth who are isolated in the suburbs of London, of Paris, and who go online and get these videos, that feed them propaganda and things like that. This is how they become radicalized. Not so much just from the country that they came from, although that could be part of it, but it's more that the radicalization takes place once they're actually in these isolated suburbs. But as we said, many Islamic people have not only assimilated into Europe, but they've become famous in Europe. We saw Ozil for Germany. and the soccer player for the German national team. And this is a great example. He's one of the most popular, I guess they'd say football players. We would say soccer players in the world right now. His name is Mohammed Salah. He plays in the UK Premier League, and he is from Egypt originally. His name is Mohammed. He's Islamic, and it hasn't stopped him from becoming extremely unpopular in the UK and in Europe in general. So he's a hero for Islamic populations in general who live in Europe, but he's very popular with Europeans in general. He has faced some incidences of racism and slurs from fans. There's no question about that sometimes, but overall he is a celebrity. There's no question about it. But at the same time, it's interesting. He's a good example of someone who, in Islam, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is to celebrate Ramadan, which is the month of fasting. And Salah, like many other Islamic players, fasts from the time that the sun comes up until the sun comes down and doesn't eat during the day. So if that falls in international soccer games or just Premier League soccer games, it's kind of like, too bad. He plays without eating, So that's something to think about. That actually has affected many, many Islamic athletes who, if the games are during the month of Ramadan, they basically play on an empty stomach, essentially. And that's a symbol of how, in the bigger picture, there are Muslims across Europe who do the same thing, who aren't celebrities. In other words, who work at, grocery stores and architects and teachers and stuff like that, who also, go through this month of Ramadan while everybody else is eating, who's not Islamic. They are not. So it's just an interesting cultural dichotomy that happens during the month of Ramadan. We see that in the U.S. too, but there's just much more presence of Islam, say, in France. And so you see it a little bit more. Last but not least, let's look at what are the major trends in Islam in the last decade or so, which has been the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring is the name for a movement, sort of a domino effect. It started in 2011. In the spring of 2011, and in some ways it never really ended. Basically, it started in Tunisia. You see on the cartoon at the bottom. In Tunisia, all these different dictators in Islamic countries is what those dominoes are, and who all were sort of toppled in some way, or at least challenged. And so in Tunisia, which is a small country in North Africa, there was a street vendor who had a dispute over, I think, his license or something like that with the local government that he thought was corrupt. And he, in protest of that, he got very upset and he lit himself on fire, self-immolation. And it went viral on the internet. And that was a sort of marker or symbol of rage in the Islamic world against these corrupt governments that they had. And other people kind of took up the mantle. And the next domino you see at the bottom, Mubarak was a dictator in Egypt, a much larger country, where people refused to go inside for weeks at a time. This was on CNN and all the news in the world. For 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, people just would not go inside. They were out in Tahrir Square in Cairo in protest of their dictator until he stepped down. And after weeks and weeks, sure enough, he finally did. And so they had a revolution in Egypt where they brought down a dictator who had been there for 3 decades, Mubarak. And it has not been entirely peaceful and smooth since then, but that at least they made that change. In actually, it was a lot of the younger generation with Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that helped to create these kind of flash mob protests during that Arab Spring in Egypt. And you had the deposition of Gaddafi, Muammar Gadaffi, who was a dictator for 40-something years, that was there when I was a kid in the 80s. And he's just committed atrocities, horrible things that he did in Libya. He's really a deranged human being. And he was ultimately, he lived in a compound. They actually dragged him out of the street. And on somebody's cell phone camera, they shot him actually right there on the street and dragged him around. So that was put on YouTube and that went viral. And then the second to last domino that you see there is Assad, the president of Syria, who's using chemical weapons against his own people. He was a member of a very small group, the Alawite minority in Syria, but You might wonder how it is 10% of the country was Alawites. How could they possibly survive, with just 10% of the country over the other larger groups? And the answer is a couple things. A, Syria is a fractured country between several groups, but also especially that Assad and the Alawites were Shia, and they were getting they were getting money from Iran, who funds other Shia groups around the Middle East. So they were getting money from Iran, and they were getting weapons from Russia, who essentially overproduces weapons, and then they are one of the world's biggest arms dealers from their overproduction of weapons. So Syria had a civil war, and that actually was then the source of those millions of refugees who then came to Europe from there. So Arab Spring, big movement in a way, still ongoing because you still have a lot of tumultuous situations in the Middle East. You still have a fragmented Syria, and you still have even other countries like Yemen, for example. Yemen is a country which has literally one of the worst malnutrition, food insecurity, water insecurity issues with these Houthi rebels that are fighting against the government there. Yemen is a poster child for UN type of aid programs and things like that. And so it's an ancient country with a great traditions. It was where gold, frankincense, and myrrh came from, the stuff that the wise men brought to Jesus in the ancient incense roots of ancient times. Geographically, you can see Yemen is down there at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. And while all the other countries on the Arabian Peninsula have oil and have riches from oil, including Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, which includes Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and then Oman, Yemen does not. Yemen does not have the oil. And so they are the odd man out. They are sort of the poor man of the Arabian Peninsula. And so just like in any other culture, when you have criminals and gangs and things like that, they tend to cluster in poorer neighborhoods because it's poorer neighborhoods where they can't pay for cops. They can't pay as much for security. They don't have as good security. Well, it's no different here in Arabia. The wealthier countries can fight and expel those kind of radicals, all those other oil countries, but the one that's the poorest, Yemen, has a much harder time doing that. And so Yemen has really had a lot of problems with terrorism right there. Of course, it's right across the Red Sea there from Somalia, which is, again, has been run by warlords and other groups in some parts of it as well, and has piracy of oil tankers, very dangerous region of the world. And you might wonder, well, is Yemen just like a very small country? It's just a few people there, and it's not a very big country physically, but it's got 32 million people, and Canada has 38, so it's a pretty big population. 32 million people is a lot. So sometimes it's easy to underestimate just how many people live in some of these countries in the Islamic world, which helps to explain why there's sometimes the food scarcity and the water scarcity, because in the entire that region, the Islamic Arabian Peninsula, you have largely desert in those countries, and the wealthier oil countries there, like United Arab Emirates, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, they can pay for desalination plants to get the salt out of the ocean water and then use that for everyday water. But the countries that are much poorer, like Yemen, they can't do that as much, and so they have these water scarcity issues on a much larger scale than you see anywhere else in those regions. So that's a look at the geography of Islam. We saw many different regions in the world, many different countries in the world, and how Islam plays out differently in terms of politics and culture and immigration, all these different issues. And so if you follow Islam, you can see it's very diverse. It's diverse in the way it's practiced. It's diverse in the cultures that were underlying Islam, the ethnic groups. And it's very interesting to see how it plays out. I hope you continue to explore Islam around the world.